name's Jeff Robinson, and last year I authored a book named Saved by Grace Through Faith, or Saved by Decree, which is a biblical and theological critique of Calvinism. And this series of videos is based on this book. And last time we looked at a couple of scriptures that are used and appealed to by Calvinists to justify a notion of unconditional election. That is the idea that God chooses who will and won't be saved, apart from anything in the person. Nothing in the individual justifies God's choice of them for salvation. That's unconditional election. Unconditional election is really based and flows from the Calvinist notion of God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty is expressed whenever anything that God wills to be done takes place. And if something happens in the universe that is not willed by God and ultimately caused by God, God is seen to be out of control. So the nature of God's sovereign rule is involved with this issue of election. As far as the salvation of any individual is concerned, this works out in God deciding who will and won't be saved. That's how God's sovereign will is manifested in the realm of salvation. Now, in the last video, we looked at a couple of texts, scriptural texts, that are appealed to by Calvinists to justify this notion of unconditional election. Today, I want to look at a couple of theological issues that arise from this topic, and especially as they arise as an expression of God's sovereignty. The first is what I call the problem of divine determinism. Divine determinism is the view that God determines everything that happens as an expression of his sovereignty. Literally everything that happens is ultimately caused by God, ultimately, as an expression of his sovereignty. There are other forms of determinism, for example, naturalistic determinism. In this view, the so-called laws of nature determines everything that happens in the universe. In principle, if one knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at any given moment, then knowing all the governing laws of nature, one could calculate the exact state of the universe at any time in the future. This view of naturalistic determinism is predicated on the view that the laws of nature determine everything that happens, and that one's actions and choices and movements and so on, like the movement of the moon and the sun and so on, are determined by laws of nature inexorably. They cannot be changed. And so those laws are effectively determining what happens. There's also psychological determinism. All human behaviour can be explained by appeal to antecedent causes, that is, causes in the life of the individual before the current time, maybe when he was a kid, that causes that person to act in the way he or she does. Such antecedent causes may be hereditary, genetic, social, or environmental. Perhaps the most famous proponent of this form of determinism was the psychologist and social philosopher B.F. Skinner. The term behaviorism is often associated with his name. He boldly asserted that, quote, the autonomous agent to which behaviour has traditionally been attributed is replaced by the environment. That's behaviorism. That's psychological determinism. Most people reject such notions of determinism or feel uncomfortable with it. It brings into question the reality of human freedom and its corollary, the reality of human responsibility for actions taken. Now, ironically, the Calvinist Albert Mohler has brought this out very well, this connection between free will, moral accountability. He says this: the link between moral choice and moral responsibility is virtually instinctive to humans. As a matter of fact, it is basic to our understanding of what it means to be human. We hold each other responsible for actions and choices. But if all our choices are illusory and everything is merely the inevitable consequence of something beyond our control, moral responsibility is an exercise in delusion. Yet, ironically, divine determinism still involves actions that are, quote, beyond our control. The fact that it is God who is the determining agent does not make all our choices and actions less determined, and hence seriously calls into question moral responsibility. You could say, don't blame me for killing that man, God made me do it. Here's a quote from my book. In a realm where everything that happens flows inexorably from an antecedent cause, in this case God, then the reality of human responsibility for actions taken by a person is effectively undermined and removed. This is necessarily so because the human agent in the final analysis could do no other than he in fact does. In fact, to praise someone for doing what he was determined by God to do, or to blame someone for doing what they could not avoid doing, becomes not only unjustified, but ultimately meaningless. There are other problems associated with divine determinism, but I don't have time to look at them right here. Look into my book if you want to see further issues associated with this issue of divine determinism, the problems it raises. Here's another theological issue associated with unconditional election as an expression of God's sovereignty. What about the wills of God, or the will of God? The Bible indicates that God's will is expressed in 4 distinct ways. His prescriptive will, expressed in the commands of God. This is not a problem. Both Calvinists and non-Calvinists agree that God has clearly made prescribed rules by which we are to live. Thou shalt not murder expresses God's prescriptive will in the form of a commandment. God's will of disposition is another expression of God's will. Sometimes God expresses what he wishes to happen, but does not necessarily command to happen. This is God's will of disposition. God wills that all people be saved, but not in fact are actually saved. This is an expression of God's desire. God wants all people to be saved. God desires that believers share one another's burdens. Another expression, but sometimes believers don't share one another's burdens. God desires that the rich act fairly towards the poor, in Leviticus 19 verse 15, for example. These are all expressions of God's will of disposition, what God would desire, would like and wishes, but doesn't necessarily happen. Now, God's decretive will is another will of God. God's will is expressed in decrees he established. For example, God decreed that the universe would come into existence. These are unilateral decisions made by God that don't involve anybody else. God decreed that he would send his son to be the saviour of the world. God decreed that wicked people be punished. God's decretive will is quite a legitimate area of God's will. God's permissive will. It is God's will that people be permitted to make certain choices and decisions themselves. He permits them to act relatively independent of his own will. We see this expressed in James 4:15. Traders can be so preoccupied with their desire to make money that they forget that they can only do so if God permits them. Here is what James 4:15 says. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, that's God's permissive will, we will live and also do this or that. Our lives and our breath is dependent on God's permissive will, whether he permits it to happen or not. Now the question arises as to how these differing expressions of God's will relate to one another. Let's look first at the non-Calvinist understanding of God's will. In this chart here we see the 4 wills of God quite distinctly bounded from and distinct from one another. God's decretive will, God's prescriptive will, God's permissive will, and God's will of disposition. So, for example, God may prescribe, command, thou shalt not murder, but whenever a murder occurs, it's an expression of God's permissive will. He has permitted the murderer to murder the victim. God's will of disposition, God desires that all be saved, all come to a knowledge of the truth. But many don't. So we see that God's permissive will has been allowed to take precedence over God's will of disposition in this case. So these different aspects of God's will all function independently of one another, effectively, and have their own bounded realms. Within the Calvinistic understanding of the wills of God, we see a different picture. We don't see any permissive will, because the idea of anybody acting independently of God, God's will, however expressed, is really not ultimately a valid expression of God's will at all. So there's no permissive will, God allowing people to make decisions that go contrary to his will. But we do have God's prescriptive will. We see that clearly in the Ten Commandments, for example. All moral precepts are expressions of God's prescriptive will. We see God's will of disposition. God may command that you shall not murder, but in fact, God can command that God's will of disposition is in contrast. This is what God wishes to take place, God wishes to happen, but doesn't necessarily happen. So we see that. But the problem here with Calvinism is that God's decretive will, what God decrees, is actually all-encompassing. It encompasses everything, and in effect swallows up God's prescriptive will and God's will of disposition. God's decretive will is overarching, it's all-encompassing, and it's fine-grained. It addresses and covers every aspect of life in the universe. Here's a problem with the Calvinist view, and I quote from my book. No matter how qualified or nuanced the will of God is parsed by Calvinists, in the final analysis, if they are to be consistent, it is always and only God's secret, decretive, sovereign will that is operative. This may be seen, for example, in Grudem's basic definition of God's will. Quote, God's will is that attribute of God whereby he approves and determines to bring about every action necessary for the existence and activity of himself and all creation, end quote. So we see there God's decretive will, God's will of decree, is overarching. Everything that happens in creation is determined by God. Within a Calvinistic system, God's decretive will trumps all other aspects of God's will. It is overarching and comprehensive, fine-grained. Now, a serious problem arises for Calvinism in this scenario. A tension arises when God's prescriptive will, thou shalt not murder, conflicts with God's secret decretive will, the latter manifesting itself whenever someone is murdered. The problem results in a contradiction within God, for it is God who expresses his will through laws and commands, and it is the same God who determines that those very precepts are violated on at least some occasions. And so we have the rather strange situation in which God's decree contradicts his commands. God commands thou shalt not kill, but he has decreed that a murder take place. There's a contradiction there. And God's decree is what actually effects the outcome. It's not God's commands. Similarly, any disposition of God that is pleasing to him is contradicted when that disposition or desire is not followed because of God's decretive will. Once again, we have the rather strange situation in which God's decree contradicts that which is pleasing to him. So, for example, it pleases God that all should believe upon Christ, but many do not. And why don't they within a Calvinistic system? It's because God has decreed that they don't. And God has decreed that some do, but some don't. And so we see here that God's decree contradicts that which is pleasing to him, that God desires all people to come to a knowledge of the truth and be saved. Typically, Calvinists seek to resolve these tensions, these contradictions, by appeal to mystery. I find this move quite unsatisfactory and a cop-out actually for bad theology. Look at the links below. I have 3 of them, and a link to my book on Amazon, an interview that I did with Leighton Flowers on Soteriology 101, and a review of my book, a fair review of my book, by Pastor Sean Willison. In the next video, we'll look at some scriptures that are appealed to by Calvinists to justify a notion of limited atonement, the L in tulip. Until then, bye for now.